Ok, listos. Okay. Bueno, bienvenidos a todos a PNP en vivo. Gracias por acompañarnos virtualmente en estos momentos que nos piden tanto. Los que trabajamos en PNP nos esforzamos en traerles sus autores favoritos y los libros que más desean. En cualquier momento durante el evento pueden conectarse a nuestra página web para comprar Finding Latinx. Si tienen alguna pregunta para Paola Ramos o para Jennifer Palmeri, por favor, usen el botón Q&A al pie de su pantalla. Una vez más, mil gracias a todos ustedes, nuestros leales clientes, por acompañarnos. Gracias a su apoyo, podemos continuar con nuestra misión y nos mantenemos en espíritu alto. Estos son momentos difíciles para las librerías independientes. Su apoyo es crucial para nosotros y se lo agradecemos mucho. Good evening, everyone. I'm Micaela Cohen-Fuentes. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you all to PNP Live. Thank you for joining us in our virtual format in the midst of truly extraordinary times. We strive to continue to bring you the authors you love and the books you crave. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Paola Ramos's book, Finding Latinx, on the Politics and Prose website. If you have a question for Paola Ramos or Jennifer Palmeri, who will be in conversation with her, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Before we begin, we want to sincerely thank you for being with us today. We're so grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. This is a challenging time for small businesses, including independent bookstore, and your support really means the world to us. Es un placer presentarles esta noche a Paola Ramos. Paola Ramos es la presentadora de Latinx en Vice y contribuyente semanal de Telemundo News, en donde le proporciona a la comunidad Latinx un espacio para contar sus historias. Paola ha pasado la mayor parte de su carrera trabajando dentro del ámbito del Partido Demócrata. Fue directora adjunta de los medios de comunicación para hispanos con Hillary Clinton. Y el presidente Obama le seleccionó como funcionaria a la Casa Blanca después de haber trabajado en su campaña electoral del 2012. Paola es mexicana, cubana, española y americana. Paola Ramos, en su nuevo libro, Finding Latinx, analiza cómo la juventud Latinx en los Estados Unidos está redefiniendo identidades, empujando barreras y despertando políticamente, con fuerza y sorprendente creatividad. Muchas de las voces de este grupo, que incluye afrolatinos, indígenas, musulmanes, queer, indocumentados, cristianos y más, han sido ignorados, reprimidos y censurados. Estas voces se han diluido entre la complejidad de los grupos en los casi 60 millones de latinos en los Estados Unidos. Gracias al trabajo de Paola Ramos, no serán más ignorados. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Paola Ramos is a host and correspondent for Vice and Vice News, as well as a contributor to Telemundo News and MSNBC. Ramos was a deputy director of Hispanic media for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign and a political appointee during the Barack Obama administration. She also served in President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. In her new book, Finding Latinx, Paola Ramos explores how young Latinx people across the United States are redefining their identities, pushing boundaries, and awakening politically in powerful and surprising ways. Many among this community, including Afro-Latinos, Indigenous people, Muslims, queer and undocumented who live in large cities and small towns, are voices who have been systematically overlooked, if not repressed and censored. These voices have been diluted among the diverse population of almost 60 million Latinos in the US. No longer. Paola Ramos's work highlights the importance of these voices. Paola Ramos will be in conversation with Jennifer Palmeri, author of She Proclaims, Our Declaration of Independence from a Man's World. Jennifer was a White House communications director for President Obama and head of communications for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. She is also a guest host of Showtime's The Circus and a contributing editor to Vanity Fair. Jennifer Palmeri es la autora de Ella Proclama, Nuestra Declaración de Independencia del Mundo de los Hombres. Jennifer fue directora de comunicaciones en la administración de President Obama y jefe de comunicaciones en la campaña presidencial de Hillary Clinton. Ella es contribuyente de Vanity Fair. Thank you again for joining us on PNP Live. I'll turn it over to our authors. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en vivo desde sus casas. Es un placer darles la palabra a Paola Ramos y Jennifer Palmeri.
Thank you. Thanks, Mika. Wait, Jen, are you going to do the interview in Spanish?
See, look, you've already got me. I've already got me knocking my laptop off of my ice. It's like ice. What do we call these things?
Yeah, that.
I'm in my hotel room. I got my laptop resting seriously on the ice bucket. And I can't
the literal
do it,
ice bucket. I see.
Yeah, the ice bucket to have it elevated properly. So yes. No, I can't do it in Spanish, pal. I can't do it in Spanish, but no. I'm getting lots of text messages from people who are watching, including my sister Lisa, who says she's a big fan from watching you on MSNBC. So that's fun. Paola, congratulations. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you. Honestly, I don't know how you've written more than one book. It's crazy.
It is sort of nuts now that we're at the 4-year mark to, I feel like none of us sort of allowed ourselves a moment to breathe.
That's right.
And just sort of felt compelled to keep going. And now that we're at the 4-year mark, I'm feeling the need to, the room to sort of step back and evaluate, and the need to sort of step back and evaluate. But, and I want to talk about your experience after 16 and why you did this, but let's start with, what is Latinx? I know that it is. Explain the term. You're indoctrinate us into your interpretation of the term. And I know that it is, not without controversy, which not shockingly to me, I know you fully embrace. So
yes. So the way that I see Latin, I think the controversy stems from the fact that we're in the process of defining the word, right? And so a lot of people are like running with that in many different directions. Some people will say that Latinx, I've heard it so many times. Latinx is for communists, no, it's for the socialists, it's for the crazy liberals.
And where does that come from? Why does it just the X? Just because X sort of signifies other?
I think the X. The X scares people, right? The X is like the unknown, and unknowns. I mean, we know this. Unknowns create fear among people, especially when you think you know a community, you think you know a label, then suddenly here's this like young person saying Latinx, Latinx. No one really knows how to pronounce it. They reject that. The way how I try and break it down for people is it is nothing more but a more inclusive way of referring to the 60 million Latinos of us that live in this country, right? And so the X is there for anyone that has ever felt left out of that label and that community and that story, whether that is Afro Latinos, queer Latinos, indigenous Latinos, trans Latinos, Latinas, right? I think of people like my grandmother who were told to be a certain way and to fit a certain box, but always wanted more. The labels for both liberals and conservatives. So it simply forces us to like break every single stereotype that folks have had of us, including ourselves for decades.
And why after 16 did you decide that you wanted to do this particular journey? Because I know what you did, and tell us a little about what you did, about how you went. You have the map in the book of the path that you went throughout the country and going into Latinx communities and finding these really interesting, really amazing stories, really amazing American stories, also Latinx stories, part of America.
Exactly. But but now we say like this, but like I didn't even know that. And so I'll even ask you, like, do you remember in 2016 us ever saying the word Latinx?
I remember knowing that it was a thing and being uneasy about using it because I wasn't sure what it meant and who you would offend by using it.
Right. I barely even remember. In fact, I don't recollect ever saying the word. And so that,
I was still struggling with the, do you say Hispanic? Do you say Latina? Like Latin, like Latino? What's the right thing to do?
Right. And I think, and that's also part of the story. Like, I feel like a lot of Latinos right now, like we are going through some form of identity crisis where like you just ask us the most simple question, which is like, how do you identify? And like, what box do you click? And we don't know. No, it's very complicated. And so that is part of the reason why I write this book. But honestly, I think for me, obviously we all have our moments of awakening after the election. One of them for me is, I remember perfectly walking to the Clinton headquarters in the morning. And I remember looking at the Miami Herald And the story in the Miami Herald was that Miami-Dade County was voting at such incredible rates that we thought that we were going to win Florida. I remember perfectly, And
so
then
this was like the early vote returns or on election day?
This is early. This is election day. This is election day. And then, fast forward, obviously we lose. We don't have to, talk about that. But I do remember being struck by the fact that, like, at the end of the day, less than 50% of Latino eligible voters showed up, right? And I think I was convinced, I think we were all convinced that regardless of your political inclinations, the threat of Donald Trump was enough to ensure that Latinos would show up in astronomical numbers, and that we would be somewhat responsible for the fact that, like, he wouldn't make it to the White House. And so, that's the story that we all believed. And so I think when that didn't happen, it just forced me to understand that, like, I didn't even have an accurate understanding of everyone we had missed. I didn't even understand, like, how I had changed and evolved and what the differences were between myself and, like, someone like my dad. And so that's sort of like the origin behind the book, of just, like, going back to a lot of these battleground states, going back to, like, the country that I thought I knew and the community that I thought I knew, and just, like, going in with a blindfold and being like, I'm going to talk to folks that I never have, right? And understand stories that I had never thought about before.
I have found that similar, like, this just, like, desire to really understand America. I remember on Thursday before the election, we were in North Carolina with Bernie, and Pharrell Williams came with us because we were hoping that he would help us with, like, African-American turnout in the early vote. And you're just like, that's a lot to put on his shoulders on the Thursday before the election. And he was really concerned that we were going to lose. And he was really concerned that, what he saw as a lack of reason for African-Americans to turn out to vote. Just like that, they just thought, like, it wasn't going to matter one way or the other. Not sure that their voice really mattered. And I remember saying to him, Donald Trump is not going, saying to him, just finally turning to him, he was just like all over me about all these things that we should do in the final weekend to try to make a difference. And I looked at him and I said, America is not going to elect Donald Trump. It's just not going to do it. And he looked at me and he said, I hear you. I respect you. I see a different America than you.
Really? And what did you think in that moment?
Just a chill just ran through me. And it wasn't the first time that you saw, like, a little crack in the universe where you saw the universe in which he could win. Right. But that, obviously, he was so close. We were so close. He was so right. But it made me see there's so many different Americas, and it just, like, your own perspective matters so much.
Of course.
And as what I find about your journey was, it wasn't just about, like, the Latinx in America, is like the Latinx in you. I mean, you describe it as a coming out process and discovery process for yourself too. So tell us a little bit about that.
So the way that I see the book is, yes, it was a coming out process for me. But what I find in a lot of the different stories is that everyone in some way is coming out of their shadows, of their stereotypes, of their boxes. And so
it really does seem like that's the case, doesn't it? I mean, across the country, just,
I
Me Too is part of that movement. I mean, I feel that in my own life, the 2 books that I wrote, but and it does, and you just, this sort of awakening, but
that's it. Yeah. And that's exactly. So it does, and when I think of my coming out story, it was just this idea that when I heard the word Latino or Hispanic, it carried so much weight and, like, so much of a story already that I necessarily didn't feel included in that. And I can, the first thing that pops up is, like, growing up watching my dad do the news and be a news anchor in Univision, and having the background, like the telenovelas in the background, and, the Latinas that I saw on TV all day long. And, I just remember being a kid and not identifying myself with that image, right? So that's the first thing that comes to mind. And then, I remember also being, even when I would go to Mexico, when I go in certain, more traditional Latino spaces, I do have vivid memories. And to this day, I'll do that, where I feel like I can't be, gay, or I can't be queer. And so you sort of have to assimilate and adapt to certain spaces. And I remember being in Washington, D.C., right? Then being, being in Latino circles, and then saying, I feel this, but I don't feel that. And can I be everything at the same time? And so it's just been a trajectory of, like, ping ponging between, like, cities and identities and cultures and labels. And so that's why I say that it was, like, that Latinx for me was kind of like coming out, because the word without even understanding why, it felt right. It felt smoother. And it felt like in that word was all these different parts of me. Right. And so
smoother when it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you wrote that. You said like as soon as you heard it, you were like, oh, that's me.
Without knowing what it meant. And that's the curious thing about the word. Of course, it inspires rejection, and we can like talk about that. But I think for a lot of people that go beyond the queer circle, right? Because the origin of Latinx does start in the early 2000s among queer Latinos that are online and that are trying to break the, you know, gender norms and make the word more inclusive. But I think the controversy is that it's morphing into something else, right? That suddenly you have older folks saying it, you have people in mainstream media saying it, you have, you know, people that look very different that are not just queer saying the word. And I think most people will tell you because it feels right. No, it feels better. It feels more inclusive. Yeah.
It feels more inclusive. And then that I guess like if it, you know, you're describing like what you saw on television growing up and Latinas, I was like, that's not, you know, it does seem that it does pinpoint you as being a certain kind of person and not.
Yeah. And I think it's just an exercise, right? It's like, when I say the word Hispanic and when I say the word Latina, I'm sure unconsciously your mind takes you somewhere. I won't even ask you, but
it just did. Yeah. It just did.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And so that is, most people will have the same
and it's
reaction.
not you. That's not where my mind goes. My mind does not go to Pal. Yeah.
No.
Right.
And it probably won't take you to a Black immigrant, and it probably won't take you to a Black Latina, and it probably won't take you to an Indigenous person. It probably won't take you to a Latino Muslim. And so it is simply a mental exercise of like opening up the conversation. That, you know, that's all.
I want to talk about some of the people that you write about in the book, but one thing I loved was a story about talking to your grandfather about this. And he was like, "Bow, what is Latinx?"
Yeah. He's like, "What the hell is that?"
Yeah. So tell that story, because there's a good intergenerational story there.
Completely. So he, you know, my context, my grandpa, almost 80 years old, you know, he's an old dude. He's a Cuban exile and came to this country in the 60s, obviously fleeing the Castro regime, and, you know, has most of his life identified with with Republicans. But he's always been at his core a very, very, very open person. And so when I started writing this book and I started tossing the word in like family dinners, he literally was like, "¿Qué es eso? Like, what are you talking about? How do you pronounce this word? Why?" And at the end of the day, it took me a while to understand, but I look at my grandfather, and to me, he is the living definition of the X and what Latinx is supposed to mean, right? And because he is a person that came to this country and that perhaps was told that he had to live a certain way, but chose to redefine himself and break barriers along the entire way. And then I think back on my grandpa, and I think without even him realizing, you know, our house was always full of other Cuban exiles. And I remember having like dinner table in our own dinner tables, like there were Afro Cubans in the dinner table, and he would always have like queer Cubans in the dinner table. And I told him, like, look at your own self, right? Like you embody this term because you don't let anyone define you. And now I look at my grandpa today, just this day, you know, he is the one that this morning he started tweeting about Joe Biden. And he said, for the first time ever, he broke his own stereotype, and he said, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they're not communists and they're not socialists. And he was once again breaking a whole new stereotype and breaking our idea of what Cubans are. And that to me is also Latinx, you know? And so I won't tell you, he won't say he's Latinx. If I ever hear that, that's crazy. But he embodies the word for me.
For you, he does. And I love that he's taken to Twitter. That's amazing.
Oh my God. Yeah, no, he loves Twitter.
My father follows me and my niece, you know, my niece, Rebecca Drager.
Of course, yeah.
He follows us on Twitter, but otherwise
I'm sure.
Yeah, it's
he
impressive.
Tweets all day long.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Love it.
You talk about that Latinx community, that, you know, all these voices that you spoke to in your journey were all in the shadows somehow, right? So either they were undocumented or Afro Latina and not recognized, or gay and felt like they weren't seen, or just like across the board, all of this. And you're right, I thought it was so beautiful that the community is in the process of coming into the sun. And so explain the journey that you take, and maybe a couple, I have some specific people that I want to ask you about, but a couple of people that you met along the way. I wanted to ask you especially, but is it Daniela? Is that how you say it?
Danieli. Yeah. Danieli.
Okay. And also Enrique, but if there's others that I wanted to tell us about.
Yeah, Enrique.
Yeah.
I mean, so that you say the sun, right? And the way that I just thought about it was like, imagine that you put all 60 million of us out of the shadows. You put just a sunlight on top of us, on us. Sorry, sometimes I don't get my prepositions in English. You put the sun over us. Like, what does that look like? No, what do we all look like under the sun, right? And just thinking about that metaphor and that image, just to that helped me sort of write the book and think about the book. And so it just became a sort of like a road trip across the country, right? So I was in California, and in California, I decided to embed there with.
I love how you call California the heartland.
Exactly. So the exercise was walking into these states kind of with a blindfold, but also rethinking geography, right? So rediscovering places and shifting the ideas, right? So the heartland, we all think about it as the Midwest, but to me, I found it in the border, right? Why? Because at the end of the day, the people that are like feeding us every day, right, that are sort of fighting for us to like have food at the table, it's in the Central Valley of California. It's in the border. And so that was part of the exercise. The same thing happened when I went to the Midwest, right? When I went to the Midwest, I call that chapter home. Yeah. Because the same, you wouldn't expect to see Latinos in the Midwest, but then you start to understand that for decades, generations of Latinos are making the Midwest feel like home. And I felt more like home there than I had in other places. And so it was just like reshifting ideas of geography. But anyways, I'm in California. I make my way over to Arizona. In Arizona, I spent some time with some folks that were just crossing the border that were indigenous. I go to Texas, and in Texas, the idea was, I don't want to spend time thinking about the wall or thinking about immigration. Let me look beyond the wall, right? So I embed and I spent some time with Latinas that are fighting for reproductive justice, that are saying things out loud like abortion, right? Because it's too taboo in their own households to say it out loud. And so they're helping each other to create languages and words and saying things out loud for the first time. So in Texas, I spent time there. I go over to Florida, which is where I was born. And it was a whole exercise of like rediscovering Miami, go over to the South. Spent some time in Georgia and in South Carolina, come across this like vibrant, incredible indigenous Mayan community, right? I spent time with children that are speaking in their indigenous languages, which is incredible. And same, I'm in New York City, and I call that chapter invisible because, I took for granted that I knew everything that was happening here. And I took for granted that this was a liberal city. And then, you start to see things that I hadn't before, like there's a big Latino Muslim population that I had no idea about, right? And so I spent some time with them and so forth. But it was all just an exercise of walking into these states with a blindfold.
And what did you find that, is there something that connected everyone?
I would say, I think is what we're seeing right now already with turnout. I think it is that the younger generation, first of all, that they're in every state and in every story, there was a point of pain, right? Everyone had a pain or a trauma, whether it was theirs or their families. But there was pain in everything. But then in all of them, it was also this idea that the younger generation that grew up watching their parents assimilate, watching their parents or their moms sort of like succumb to inequalities and normalize inequalities, all of the younger generation and all the younger people I talked to were rejecting that, right? And that's why I think we're seeing this like coming out, which obviously you're seeing as well. But everyone that I talked to was like, I don't want that for me, my parents said yes to this, like that's not right. And so that's the connectivity among everything, which I think we're seeing in the polls right now. Many people are voting because of that, I think.
Yeah, it's so reassuring that people that, it's just like, and that's what struck me about the story about, I can't say her name, Danieli, about is that even though they watched the generation that's older than them, the generation that raised them, accept compromises, they're not willing to do it, right? And so with her, it just, she came, so she has, seems like she lives in the world with so much confidence.
That's
and could you identify where that came from? Was it just something in her gut, that just as a human spirit, she saw that she had worth that she, that maybe the world didn't see, that she believed in, or was it something about her environment? I mean, it's really interesting how she changed from, she grew up in New York and then going to LA is sort of like a experience. People react to her differently and her experience there is different, but just how much confidence she had was really,
I think it's a combination.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a combination, right? Like Daniele, as you mentioned, she grew up in.
Explain a little bit about her, about her, who she is.
So Daniele grows up in the Dominican Republic, and she grows up being told to get out of the sun, that your hair shouldn't. Daniele is Afro-Latina. Sorry, let me start with that.
Yeah.
She's Afro-Latina, and she's in the Dominican Republic. And as I said, she grows up with people saying, don't look too dark because you're gonna look like a Haitian, right? This is exactly what she told me. And get under the sun because you don't want your skin to look that way. No, your nose is too big. You don't want that. No, you're you're too Black or you're too Latina. So it was always one of those things.
And this is in her own country. She's being
this is in the DR. Yeah. And then the interesting thing is when Daniele and her mom, when she comes to the United States, Daniele was undocumented. And she was Afro-Latina, and so just that in and of itself, like already you sort of become invisible in the like immigration narrative, right? Like folks that are like undocumented and Black immigrants are somewhat lost in both the immigration system and even the criminal justice system. But the interesting thing is when Daniele gets here to New York City, she finds a home, in the Bronx amongst other Afro-Latino Dominicans. And she starts owning it, right? And she starts, as she says, like falling in love with herself and falling in love with her Afro-Latinidad and falling in love with her own beauty. And she develops this voice. And you see that voice in activism, that suddenly she's one of the dreamers that's out here chanting. She develops the voice in her art. She becomes an incredible poet. And she becomes very, very, as she says, like in love with what it means to be her. But then the interesting thing, which was also like a good mental exercise for me, was who Daniele is here in the Bronx in New York City suddenly is very different from who Daniele is in California. And so I met Daniele in California, and the first time I see her, I walk into UCLA, and she just told me, she was like, just come to UCLA, meet me here for the first time, and then we can chat. I'm like, great. So I walk into UCLA, and I sit down in a room full of, I'd say maybe they were like between 10 and 12 years old. Most of them were Mexican kids. And Daniele is in the front of the classroom, and basically she is explaining to the kids, who most of them are coming from immigrant families, she's like, I too am an immigrant, right? And a lot of the kids were like, what? And then she was like, just because I'm Afro-Latino, just because the color of my skin is darker, doesn't not mean I'm one of yours, no? The immigration story doesn't just happen through the border, no, it happens through other ways. And then I asked Daniele, I was like, who do you feel more comfortable with, right? Here in New York City, she'd say my community, Dominicans and Latinos. In California, she said Black people, right? Because she doesn't feel, to this day, she doesn't feel like she can be fully accepted as herself within, LA's Latino community. And so again, it's complex. All of these stories are really complicated. Identity is so complex in cities and in regions. And then when you crisscross the country, like who you are changes.
Yeah, it's the same individual in a different, right.
Yeah.
So the one of the questions that we have, first of all, Manuel says congratulations, which is nice.
Thank you.
And thanks to Politics and Prose. So he said, could you talk a little bit about the role of white supremacy within the Latinx community and whether we're talking enough about racism that people in our own community engage in and experience? So this is a good opportunity to talk about Enrique, who,
yes,
if I'm describing him correctly, was a member of the Proud Boys. Thinking about him is don't want to put that in the past tense. Sorry, is a member of the Proud Boys. And he seems like he gets a lot of value and purpose from the work that he does. And one thing that he said that stuck with me was, I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery. And I think you said, I'm gonna, this is a paraphrasing you, but it was like, it's as if he says, he says some really controversial, hateful things. and it's as if it's like almost like pinching himself to show that he's alive, or being provocative just to show that it's his way of embracing.
That's exactly right.
Freedom, but explain. So
yeah,
do what you can too. I know you've spent a lot of time on this with Vice too. So do what you can to illuminate us here.
Yeah. So context,
and then this, of course, goes to the question of people say like, oh my God, there's like
conservative Latinos.
There's conservative Latinos, and it's like, yes, there are.
Right, and that's part of the word too. Like two things. First, yes, we can be conservative, and two, we can and we do perpetuate racism in many ways. But the story of Enrique Tarrio, he's currently the chairman of the Proud Boys, right? So he is the #1 dude in the Proud Boys.
National chair?
He's the chairman.
Yep. I didn't realize that. Okay.
Oh yeah, no, he's the chairman, and Enrique Tarrio, your name will think he's just Latino. No, he's Afro Latino, right? He's an Afro-Cuban guy that lives in Miami. And so going into the conversation with Enrique, I mean, I automatically was like, I already was enraged. I already knew that we would have nothing in common. I had so many questions, so much so that I didn't even want to really like talk to him or like get into it, because I knew what would happen. But anyways, what I find with Enrique, right, who loves Trump, again, is like a full-blown Proud Boy. You see him in the streets, he has this like obnoxious megaphone, and he just insults people constantly all day long. But when you see that himself abstracted from everything else, you start to see a man that growing up was sort of lost in the system, right? Like no one really looked out for someone like Enrique Tarrio, because again, like what identity do you fall in? Who is Enrique Tarrio, particularly in the Miami community, right? And I think of, every time that we campaign in Miami, we always go to Little Havana. Right. That's where you get the Cuban vote. Enrique lives in Little Havana. And so I always think of like
Versailles.
You always go to Versailles. He lives a couple blocks away from Versailles, but it's
okay. Explain what Versailles is for those.
So Versailles is like the Cuban establishment in Miami. So like every campaign, if you want to win the Miami Latino vote or the Cuban vote, I must say, you go to Versailles. You go in, you do a little coffee, café con leche, and that's you do the photo op, but like you go to Versailles.
What about the fabulous Cuban steaks? I love those Cuban steaks
and the steaks
piled on top. Oh my God,
it's also good. It's
so good.
Yeah, the croquetas. Yeah, no, it's so good. But anyways, but I think of Versailles, and I'm like, when folks through the decades, politicians would go through Little Havana, like no one thinks of an individual like Enrique Tarrio, right? And so that's one thing that I find with him. The other thing is that at some point, neither Republicans nor Democrats saw him as one of theirs, no? And so you start seeing kind of where this like suddenly in Trump, I think, he sees Trump makes him believe that he can be part of the boys club. And that is appealing for a lot of Latinos, right? Because at the end of the day, of course, that's misogyny, that's sexism, that's machismo. There's a lot of that in it. But I think particularly with Cubans and with a lot of immigrants, if someone allows you to forget that you're an immigrant, some people want to forget where they come from. Some people want to not be part of the other and want to feel as American as possible. And so when Trump creates an illusion and allows you to be part of the white power and white supremacy, some people take it, And that's kind of what you're seeing in a lot of these states, including in places like Arizona and in other battleground states where like younger Latino men are inching towards Trump. A lot of it is simply like, it should, as we just said, like it shouldn't be that mind blowing. Like at the end of the day, it's just some men being men, and they get, that is Donald Trump gives them what they need to hear. But I think a lot of it has to do with like a lot of the pain that some Latinos carry, that they want to forget where they come from. And I think Enrique Tarrio is part of that.
And it may be, do you think that in the Democratic Party that immigrants are embraced so much for being immigrants, not just as being Americans, that they don't feel like they get that? Or I don't know.
I think that's always like the entry point in the conversations, right? It's typically our entry point when we talk to a lot of Latinos tends to be through the lens of immigration.
Right.
I don't think that's wrong, but I think it just we need to do more than that. No, we need to we need to talk about more than that. No, what does it mean to rebuild your life here? What does it mean to grow up here? What does it mean to be like an Afro-Cuban and you know, have multiple identities and live in different systems and feel lost? And so anyways, when I think of Enrique, I'm like, and I asked him, I'm like, why do you like Trump? Like, okay, I get it, but like, why Trump out of everyone? And he just said, porque calle. Calle means streets in Spanish. And he says, you know, because of, which you've heard 1,000 times, because street talk. No, and so when he sees himself at the same level of Donald Trump, because they both speak the same language, he loves that. No, because he is equal to a white man in power.
You write in the book of that it's easier to win the Latino vote if you think we are all the same. So it does seem, I mean, it doesn't, I mean, I've heard a lot of people who are freaking out that, you know, that some Latinos are voting for Trump. I can't understand that. And it's like, of course it's not a monolith. And of course, if it, you know, 60 million people, there's going to be a lot of different,
right.
A lot of different perspectives. And it's more, did you find, I mean, one thing I've always heard is that it's more assimilated, it's more like generations go on and Latinos are more assimilated into society. They become more conservative, just as any white ethnic would, like in Texas, for example, Arizona. Did you find that? Or is it more, or it's mostly young people you're talking to? What's the, and while you're doing that, I'll say we have a question from Thomas Cohen, who said that article in today's New York Times notes the problems that the Democrats are having in getting Latinos in Texas to vote. How do you see the problem in the U.S. in general and in Texas in particular?
I mean, in Texas, at least what I've been seeing so far is, you know, there's more than 7 million people that already voted, and a lot of them are Latinos. I think in El Paso itself, right? El Paso is a city that over 70% are Latinos, and I think they're already seeing like record turnout. And so I think Latinos are voting, and I think part of the reason why, and I mean, you're the comms guru, but I think part of the reason why is because they're part of a story now. No, they are the center of a story, and I think that's driving them, right? And when I think of El Paso, it's like obviously the massacre, those images, people don't forget about that, right? And in every state, in Arizona, in Texas, in Florida, Latinos have been part of a story, and so now when they're voting, it's because they're sort of like driving a story. And so I do.
One of the shooting victims in El Paso was a Latino man who was a Trump supporter. Trump went and met with him. Yeah, you know, it's like,
right.
This exactly. Is like in El Paso, this is, you know, this.
It's real. And I think perhaps like in 2016, perhaps at some point, there was a moment in which politics wasn't personal, right? And particularly among young Latinos, where like they could put politics to a side. But I think now, regardless of your party, like politics is personal, right? And that could be through the hate that some people have felt. It could be through COVID-19, where all of a sudden, you know, you can be as conservative as you want, as Trump loving as you want, but like COVID pretty sure has impacted you in some shape or form. And immigration also, right? Like the images that we see at the border, the stories, like it's almost impossible to like look the other way.
The children who we can't find their parents. Good, so much pity. Do you think that, so 60 million people, very, you know, even, you know, within Latinx communities, very diverse. Is there, when people say, what should the Biden campaign do to reach out to Latinx voters? You know, is there an answer for that, or is it?
I don't think so. I think they don't.
Right, because it's too big. It's too big and diverse, or it's not this monolith.
Right. I mean, I think the answer is, first of all, I think to give them a lot of credit where they deserve it. Yeah. Like they are, you know, they've invested a lot of money in ads. Like, you know, they're out there hustling. They know that it's a winning strategy. Like there's a reason why President Obama's in Florida. There's a reason why he's been there, you know, twice in the last, as he was for us, no? And so I think they know. I think it's more a question for like all of us. I think there's a lot of fear in like messing up, right? And like I think people are scared to ask just basic questions as to like, who just invest resources and understanding. I think that's just like a baseline that like no campaign has done. Like, who are young Latinos, right?
Yeah.
What do they care about? And what change do they want to see? And I always ask that question in all of my interviews with everyone, particularly with the younger folks. I'm like, who was the last time anyone asked you what change you wanted to see? I always ask that question. Most people will say never.
No one's ever asked that. Yeah. Right.
Never. And so start with that. And so I think they've done.
And what do they tell you? What change do they want to see?
I mean, most of it, especially now, the last time I asked that was when I was in Arizona. It all revolves around racial justice, right? It all revolves around like equality. And I think at the core, it's like we're also fixated on like, what are the policy issues that Latinos care about? At the end of the day, like, it's not rocket science, right? Like, no, but truly, I mean, the issues are like, it's the economy, it's healthcare, it's education. But I think the core is that there is an ache for belonging. I think that a lot of Latinos are aching for, and you don't really get that through policy discussions or through debates. You get that by truly bringing people and being very intentional about bringing them to the table from the start. No, and I think that I think is where we can all of us can do a better job at that.
Yeah.
And
I had the sense that the policy solutions aren't that mystifying, right? They're sort of there for the taking. It's that it's where politics and Congress is so dysfunctional. It's like you have to go way back to the sort of roots of how people why people believe what they believe, and understanding that to then try to be able to reach some consensus. I interviewed Nicole Hannah-Jones yesterday for my new podcast, just something about her. And
how was it?
Well, it was interesting. It was great. It was interesting though, because she started in writing about like racial disparities in healthcare and education, right? And that's like a very policy oriented subject matter, but then found in order to gain, I mean, she wouldn't put it this way, but sort of my takeaway was like, a way to gain support for those policies is to go all the way back to 1619 to explain how those disparities came about. But it does feel that we have to, it's not just arguing that what the policy is going to produce. In order to gain support for it, you have to go back, you have to understand where people are coming from, help them see, why the world developed the way that it did, illuminate, white people to see why the world developed the way they did, so that they have a different sense that it's, just because it's like, well, I'm a white man, I worked really hard to get where I did. So I'm sure you did, but a Latinx woman who worked as hard as you wouldn't get as far as you, right? So like that's, but it does seem that what's really needed is it's not just like mystical talk, particularly when Joe Biden talks about the soul of a nation. It is, you have to get people together and see different perspectives in order to develop the support for those policies. But it does seem like it's the lack of understanding that is really a crisis.
Even in that like message, right? The soul of the nation. Like a lot of people wonder, rightly so, like what soul, what nation, exactly. Somebody
shared that this is when we were talking about, coming off of the Enrique conversation, but I think it's a good transition for what we just talked about. I imagine one of these reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly, this is the Baldwin quote. Imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with pain. Do you see this as being true in Ontario?
Once hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with pain. I mean, I think a lot of people, and I'd say probably like the older generation of Latinos, like have been taught to not deal with pain, right? Like pain is always something that has been taboo. Mental health is for sure a very, very taboo issue amongst us. And so you are taught from when you're young to keep it in, and to not expose it, and to like honestly kind of like live in a bubble as much as you can, and to not burst that bubble. But the amazing thing is, I think, especially among like younger Latinos, and I saw that, when you look at the stats for like younger Latinos, the anxiety and depression rates among them are really high compared to like white folks. And a couple of years ago, they did a study and they found that young Latinas in particular, like their suicide attempts were extremely high. I spent some time in Philadelphia, and it was like a crazy stat where like 1 out of 7 young Latinas in Philly itself,
really?
had thought about suicide. And so
that's like approaching like, you know, the high schools and
exactly
tribes, like in, you know, on reservations, like where half the kids
yes
try to commit suicide. It's just, yeah,
exactly. And it's real, but I think the difference is perhaps like, and Enrique is like, you know, and he's almost 40, but I think the younger people, like they're talking about the pain, right? All the El Paso kids that were like traumatized, they're talking about it. No, I spoke to so many young Latinas that are sort of wanting to deal with pain head on, no, and with fear head on. And I think that's a difference. And I can't speak for Enrique, so I don't know if he's aware. I saw pain in him. I don't think he would ever recognize that and see that, and understand what his drive for Trump and acceptance means. But for me, it's simply someone that at some point was failed, no, and that doesn't feel good.
Do you think after writing this, you have a sense of what the elements of belonging are? Like, you know, it does seem that most of the people that you spoke with, that, you know, as they come out of the shadows into the sun, there just seems to be this like real yearning for belonging. And that may mean different things to different people, but are there some common threads of what that people are either looking for, what it might look like?
I mean, I think some and many Latinas are not waiting for answers, right? They're creating their own spaces where they belong. They're organizing amongst themselves and creating like new norms and structures where they don't need anyone's acceptance. But I think on the other end,
and is it among other Latinx, or is it?
I think black and brown
out
folks.
In the world.
I think black and brown folks, I think especially this summer, I think there's been like this pretty beautiful awakening among Latinos. And I saw it a lot after George Floyd, when people were out on the streets, and I saw a lot of young Latinas, particularly young Latinas, young Latinos, but like with postcards that said, your fight is my fight, no, tu lucha es mi lucha. And I think that is like a form of solidarity that I haven't seen in a long time. And so, I think people are learning that to be accepted, people aren't waiting for answers, right? Kind of like Ocasio-Cortez, like she's not waiting for answers. She's not waiting for people to accept her. She's doing her thing. And I think that's an attitude that I see reflected. But then the truth is that, you know, a lot of these, about my sister or young Latinas, and every time that you are accepted into a job, right? Or that you step into a space, and I felt like this before, but every time you're given something, you always have a tendency, particularly among women, which you know more than anyone, you always have a tendency to question, no? It's the imposter syndrome always comes out. And so, you know, I just tossed the question back to like the people in charge, like, how can you make people feel like they belong? And I think at the end, it's, you know, it comes from the bottom, but it can start from the top as well. Yeah.
Do you think that when you see this, people organizing themselves, sort of Latinx individuals organizing themselves, is it with other, you know, organizing to sort of engage in their world, right? However they choose to do it. Is it with other Latinx people, or is it diverse demographics, different populations?
I think it's been, I think the heart of it perhaps is Latinx, but I think the beautiful thing and the powerful thing is like seeing the allies, like even Emerson Collective, like the incredible thing about a place like Emerson Collective, or like people that are working in the immigration space, is like, it's a lot of white folks that are in, you know, in spirit and helping Latinos and dreamers. And like we know that is a winning formula, right? The more people you have from the more diverse backgrounds, and like that is a winning formula. But then I think it's different in every state. But I think for sure the winning strategy is when like we expand it. No, we expand the conversation. We bring people in. But yeah.
Did you? Someone here has written, if Biden wins next week, fingers crossed. Lola Adams, she has her fingers crossed. Us too. What is the first, this is a good question. What is the first thing the new administration should do to ensure that the Latinx community is treated better than they have been under Trump? Is that,
I mean, that'll be the new, that's going to be the new story, you know, the accountability. And, you know, Joe Biden did promise that in the first 100 days, he would create a pathway to citizenship. Mm-hmm. This is something that a lot of Latinos have heard in the past. You know, they heard it obviously, you know, in the previous administration, and it didn't happen. And so I think it's going to be our job and everyone's job to like just to hold people accountable for those words and for those promises. But I think that one thing. But I think at the end of the day, what makes Joe Biden is that he has empathy, right? And in order to treat Latinos the way that they're supposed to be treated and immigrants, you can be, you know, you can pass any policies you want, but you can't do any of that with empathy. And if you have someone at the top that has empathy the way that he has, that's invaluable. Invaluable.
Yeah.
Invaluable.
Yeah. Yes. And he's got to act on it though, right? He has to, you know, he's got to, you know,
but those are two qualities. Yeah.
If you have those qualities, and then you need to act on it and talk to, you know, listen, right?
Yes. And he listens.
This is a great question from a nice reader named Anonymous Attendee. Who says, could you describe the reader you imagined for the book as you were writing? And who did you hope would hear this particular story? Reader you imagined for the book as you were writing.
I imagined two things. I think at first I was like, I imagined myself at the end of this journey and getting this book and just trying to understand how I would like trying to put myself at the end of the journey and be like, wow, like what would it feel like for me to read this book, right? And for someone to speak to me. Mm-hmm. And then the readers that I had in mind were everyone that I interviewed, right? I wanted like queer Latinas to see something of themselves in these words. I wanted, you know, moms, I wanted my grandmother to see something of her there. I wanted people that typically aren't in books or like in, you know, on MSNBC all day to like, to see that. But then that was my main concern. But then I also hope, I think there's a story here. I hope that this book becomes more than just for Latinos, right? Or for the Latinx community, because I think there is, one of the best things that I've heard so far is like other, you know, folks from like the AAPI community or Black folks say like, I found something, I could relate to this part of the story, you know, or I saw myself here, or I struggled in the same way here. And so I hope that it just like expands all of our understandings of like how we can just be better with each other. Yeah,
I mean, there's just a lot of courage in all the people that you speak to as well. I mean, it's just,
yes.
I come out feeling really hopeful.
Me too.
Do you feel hopeful about yeah?
I do a lot. And to me, I learned it the most with there's one chapter in the story that I call Shining Light. And in Shining Light, it's, you know, when I spent some time with a trans woman, with Carolina. Anyways, the story is there, but the lesson learned with Carolina and with that story is that all of us can power through, particularly during COVID and through the hardest times, we power through because we see some form of light at the end of the tunnel, no? And we keep going because something illuminates the path. A lot of people in the Latinx community, including particularly in the trans community, can do it with their eyes closed, in complete darkness. And they keep going, even though no one is giving and illuminating any form of light. And so I just always think of them, no, if they can keep going when like the world has been so shitty to them, no, truly, and they keep going up, and they can do it in darkness, then like there's a lot to learn from that, no?
The human spirit, man, it's particularly one that's been through a lot of tribulation. It's like,
it's incredible.
It's a really, it's such an inspiring thing. But we talk about that, I'm reminded of one part where we talk about people feel that they're on the brink of, you know, almost being accepted or achieving something, or, you know,
and that's what this moment feels like. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels like it's on the brink of something good?
I think so. I look at who's running for office even, right? Like look at the Latinas that are running for office. Like that in and of itself, like if they win, it can change. It can go from the Ocasio-Cortezes of the world to the first queer Afro-Latinos in Congress, to the first Afro-Latina in Congress, to like Latino Arab in Congress. So like that gives me hope.
Yeah.
And we're always on the brink. I think we're gonna vote in crazy numbers, right? I think that's gonna make a difference. I see the way that like culture is being shifted and driven by us. Like you turn on the radio, the TV, like we're starting to be everywhere. And so I think we're living it. No, I think we're in that transition point, and a lot of it is being led by like the younger, like the Emma Gonzalez's of the word, right? That will not remain silent.
Yeah.
And that in of itself is like taking us through a different path.
It does. Yeah, it does. I mean, it just, and what I love about all the people who are running for office is even if they don't win, right? Here's what I find that's really helpful is like, it's not as if a lot of Latinx candidates looked and made a calculation, I can definitely win. They don't know that they can definitely win, but they think it's worthwhile to do it anyway.
Right. That's true.
Right. So right. If they believe that,
that's true.
Then if there's so many people, and then you find, there's a lot of women that are running that they may win, they may not win, but they believe that they should do this. That tells you more about where America's going than even if they do, if they win, it'd be great too. But that they believe that. And you just have this sense like, that like we're on the brink of, I mean, did you feel that as you're driving around? If you're driving around the country, you're like, whoa, something's really
happening you
here.
Said it yourself. Yeah, and I think that's it. Like, I think it's, you go vote and you come out and you go protest and you run for office, as you said, if you truly believe that you are worthy of change. No, if not, you don't do it. At the end of the day,
right? Like, you believe you're worthy of change, right?
Yeah, and people don't vote because they're scared. Like COVID will make you scared. Maybe you stay home for that, but you vote at the end because you believe that you deserve better. And so I think in all of the stories that I found is like people that believe that they deserve better and that they are worthy of change in a country that told them and promised them that, right? And so I feel more, even though sometimes I'm like, oh my God, like where do we live? What is this? I do feel more hope. I do.
Yeah, I mean, we had to have the reckoning at some point, right? I feel like America was founded on this great promise that we were all created equal if you're a man, white, and you owned land. And at some point, that had to be reckoned with the reality of how America was founded and what came up. And
you read Rebecca Traister's article. I think it was on The Cut yesterday. It was so good. But it was basically that, like I think she called it like the Great Awakening, but it was like.
So here's what you love about that. I haven't read the full article yet, but I read Helen Brosnan's.
Yeah.
Who's a colleague of ours from the Clinton campaign. I read her tweet about it where she did some screenshots of it. So I haven't read the whole thing, but Helen, as always, has alerted me to the world of things in the world that I need to be aware of.
Yes.
But it does. Yeah. So it's like a good place to end on an optimistic note, which everyone who reads Latinx will come away with that kind of empathy and understanding. And I mean, and actually it makes me excited about the future. And I'm so proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. For real.
So glad you did this, man. I know it is not easy, sister.
It's not, but you showed us how that, you showed us that it's not easy, but that you can do it.
You can do it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. And thank you so much to Politics and Prose for hosting this and for like being, creating these spaces. It means a lot.
It's the best.
Many thanks to you. Paola Ramos and Jennifer Palmeri, and to our audience. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this. And I cannot emphasize this enough. We cannot continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please support Paola and PNP by using the link in the chat to purchase Finding Latinx. Mil gracias otra vez a Jennifer y a Paola por el trabajo tan importante y la inspiración que nos brinda a los Latinx. Y mil gracias a ustedes, nuestro público. Sin su apoyo no podríamos presentarles este tipo de programas. Por favor, apoyen el trabajo de Paola y Politics in Prose y compren su libro Finding Latinx con un clic en la liga en nuestro chat. For more PNP Live, check out our website for updated event listings. Para información sobre nuestros programas, visiten la página web politicsinprose.com. Mil gracias a nuestras presentadoras una vez más y a nuestro público. Manténganse sanos y fuertes. A final round of thanks to Paola and Jennifer and to all of you for joining us today. From all of us at Politics in Prose, stay strong, stay safe, and stay well read. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
I love that.